the Iran nuclear deal. They've had these talks that are resumed in Vienna, and they've just finished the 7th round of talks. They'll have the 8th round beginning on December 27th. And I've covered these talks extensively, right? I've interviewed the Russian ambassador. He's leading the Russian delegation in these talks. I've interviewed the Iranian chief negotiator right now. If in case you guys haven't watched that, it's on the channel. Definitely go watch it. And so I just want to talk about how the media cover these talks, because it's really one of the most atrocious, dishonest fields in journalism, which is really saying something, right? Basically, let me break down how the media reports on the nuclear talks. You have a handful of reporters in Vienna, where the IAEA is based and where the talks are happening. So the IAEA is the UN's nuclear watchdog. You have about 5 reporters who continuously write the same crap over and over, which is basically accuse Iran of violating the nuclear deal, or paint Iran as being non-cooperative, or hard to deal with, dragging its feet. And then what they'll do is they'll go print that in other outlets. So for example, Reuters will write an article, and then CNN, NBC, they'll copy and paste the article. They'll have some sort of arrangement, right? So then you have about 5 people who are writing this verbal diarrhea that gets, copied and pasted and repeated in all of Western mainstream media, right? So you end up with things like this. In 2018, then U.S. President Donald Trump abandoned the deal, calling it too soft on Iran, and reimposed harsh U.S. sanctions, spurring Tehran to breach nuclear limits in the pact. So again, this is a very dishonest way of framing what's happening, because when Donald Trump reimposed sanctions, Iran waited an entire year after he quit the deal. So from May 2018 to May 2019, they were still following the nuclear deal. And then they started raising the level of uranium enrichment. So in the JCPOA, it's supposed to be 3.67%. That's the limit. And then they raised it past 3.67%. And then they increased the number of centrifuges, which, they have cascades. These centrifuges enrich the uranium, and they increased those numbers. And so that's not in violation of the deal. That's part of the deal. Because in the JCPOA, it talks about how to solve problems, right? It's called the dispute resolution mechanism. I want to read you what it says in here about solving problems. So this is Article 26, okay? The U.S. administration, acting consistent with the respective roles of the President and the Congress, will refrain from imposing new nuclear-related sanctions. Iran has stated that it will treat such a reintroduction or reimposition of the sanctions specified in Annex 2, or such an imposition of new nuclear-related sanctions, as grounds to cease performing its commitments under this JCPOA in whole or in part. So it's very clear. It says if you, the United States, put sanctions on Iran, Iran is going to treat that as grounds to stop implementing its part of the deal. And then if you go to Article 36, it says if Iran believed that any or all of the E3, EU plus 3, so that means, again, the UK, France, Germany, the US, Russia, China, EU. So if Iran believed that any or all of these parties were not meeting their commitments under this JCPOA, Iran could refer the issue to the Joint Commission for Resolution. And then it goes up, basically, the chain of command. It goes up to the UN and so on and so on. And then at the end of Article 36, what does it say? It says that if the issue still has not been resolved to the satisfaction of the complaining participant, and if the complaining participant deems the issue to constitute significant non-performance, then that participant could treat the unresolved issue as grounds to cease performing its commitments under this JCPOA in whole or in part, and or notify the UN Security Council that it believes the issue constitutes significant non-performance. So let me translate that. That means if Iran, in this case, sees the United States is not following the deal, then Iran is not going to follow its end of the deal. That's how you solve the problems. It's listed right here under dispute resolution mechanism. Okay? So when Iran is enriching uranium past 3.67%, Iran is increasing its number of centrifuges. That's not breaching the pact. That's what they're allowed to do in the pact. And so that's not how the mainstream media report it, right? So you'll go and you'll look up articles from pick any outlet, and they will all say Iran is breaching its limits. Oh, Iran is not complying with the deal. Complete nonsense. It's complete, absolute rubbish. I don't know if these people writing the articles are so ignorant that they haven't read the JCPOA, but they're lying. They're completely lying when they try to paint Iran as breaching, violating the deal. And in some instances, they'll do it subtly. They'll say things like, the one I just read here in Reuters, where it's breaching the limits in the pact. And then others, they'll just outright say Iran is breaching the pact or it's violating the pact. That's wrong. Now, there's another thing inside the JCPOA. This is Article 29. It says the EU and its member states and the United States, consistent with their respective laws, will refrain from any policy specifically intended to directly and adversely affect the normalization of trade and economic relations with Iran, inconsistent with their commitments not to undermine the successful implementation of this JCPOA. Let me translate that again. The EU member states, the United States, they cannot put sanctions on Iran, and they cannot do things that prevent Iran from trading with other countries and from, they can't do things that don't facilitate or normalize trade with Iran. So when Donald Trump leaves the nuclear deal in 2018, and he doesn't just leave it, he puts sanctions on Iran. He targets the oil sector, the banking sector. He does all this stuff to cripple Iran's economy. That's violating the deal, right? But they don't tell you that in the media. They just say, the U.S. left the deal. No, the U.S. did more than that. They put sanctions, and that is a violation of the deal. But they never talk about that being a violation of the deal. Like, the United States is not even in the fucking agreement. The United States is not even in the goddamn agreement. Donald Trump quits the deal. He puts sanctions. Biden continues that. Biden's been president for almost 1 year. He still hasn't gone back in the JCPOA. He's nitpicking now. He's saying, well, we'll remove the nuclear-related sanctions, but we're not going to remove the other ones. This is a very dirty game, because what the U.S. has been doing is putting sanctions on Iran and saying, well, this is because of your human rights violations, and this is because of your sponsoring terrorism activities, right? Your malign activities in the region, meaning Iran is supporting the Palestinian resistance or, the PMU or Syria, etc. And so they say, well, because this is not a nuclear-related sanction, it doesn't have nuclear in the title, we're not lifting that. Yeah, but that's still a violation of Article 29. You have to facilitate trade with Iran. You can't do things and place sanctions on Iran that make it difficult for the rest of the world to interact with Iran and trade with it. You can't do that. That violates Article 29. It doesn't matter if you call it nuclear-related or non-nuclear-related or, candy-related, whatever you want to call it. That's irrelevant. But that's one of the games they're playing. And so once again, you see how there's no difference between Biden or Trump. And, the Biden administration is basically looking at all the things that Trump has done and just running with them. They're not undoing them. They're just taking them. It's like, yeah, okay, let's continue the persecution of Assange. We're going to keep the indictment going. We're going to take this as far as it needs to go to extradite him. We're not going to get back in the Iran nuclear deal. We're going to drag our feet. We're going to paint Iran as being non-compliant. We're going to keep the sanctions in place. We're going to keep Trump's sanctions against Syria, and so on and so on and so on. And, I cover news for a living, so I see a lot of crap. But that is really something monumental. It's really disgusting. I'm not kidding. It's literally a handful of reporters, and it gets copied and pasted everywhere. And they just write this pro-Western BS that is, just rife with propaganda. It's so horrible. You need only look at the deal, at the text, and you can see clearly who's following it and who isn't. And it just, again, it speaks to this kind of arrogance. Remember, all the other parties in these nuclear talks have nuclear weapons, except Germany, right? So China, Russia, France, the UK, the US, well, the US is in indirect talks. Remember, they left the deal. They all have nuclear weapons. They're trying to basically lecture Iran about its nuclear program, which is, again, a civilian nuclear program. It doesn't have a weapons program. And another issue which they were trying to stir up a bunch of trouble in the media was the facility at Karaj. Basically, this is a hilarious story, right? The Israelis sabotaged a nuclear facility in Iran at Karaj, and they damaged the cameras, right? And you had the Western press saying that Iran is refusing to replace the cameras, and they're doing some funny business, like they won't let the IAEA replace the cameras, and no mention of Israel blowing up the goddamn facility. They act like Iran purposely, they got some engineers on a ladder to dismantle the camera. No, it was sabotage. The facility was attacked, and it was attacked by Israel, right? But they don't tell you about that. They just say Iran is refusing to cooperate with the IAEA. They're hiding something at Karaj. And so Iran basically, to shut them up, this is what they did in the last few days. Right? 15th of December, they allowed the IAEA to come in and replace the cameras. Iran was only trying to check what happened. They were saying, we'll gladly let the IAEA come in and replace the cameras, but we want to finish our investigation first. We want to know how the facility was sabotaged, what happened, right? I think any country in the world would do that if it had a nuclear facility sabotaged. And so, of course, they're using that in the media to again, do this whole boogeyman image, like, oh, look, Iran, they're doing something secret. They're building a bomb. Complete rubbish. Really, just vile coverage in the Western press. It's so horrendous, so dishonest. One of the worst fields in journalism, easily.